We have this image of medieval people. Dirty, smelly, covered in mud. We see it in movies and on TV. A peasant with rotten teeth grins, and you can almost smell his breath through the screen. A knight takes off his helmet, his hair matted and greasy. The whole era, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, is often painted as one long, unwashed slog through filth. We call it the Dark Ages, and for many, that darkness includes a deep-seated grime. The popular idea is that people back then were terrified of water, that they believed bathing was unhealthy, and that they might only have a handful of baths in their entire lifetime. Kings, queens, peasants, it didn't matter. They were all just dirty. But the thing is, that image is mostly wrong. It's a caricature, a myth built up over centuries by people who wanted to make the Middle Ages seem backward and to make themselves seem modern and enlightened. The short answer to the question, did medieval people really bathe, is yes. Yes, they did. They washed their hands and faces every day. They took full body baths, they had public bathhouses, soap, and a real concern for personal hygiene. Now, let's be clear, their world wasn't our world. They didn't know about germs. Their understanding of how disease spread was based on ideas about bad smells and imbalances in the body's humors. They didn't have indoor plumbing with instant hot water. A hot bath for them was a luxury and a chore, not a quick 10-minute shower before work. So, their standards of cleanliness were different from ours. A person considered clean in the 13th century might seem a bit ripe to us today. But that doesn't mean they didn't care or that they didn't try. They absolutely did. So, where did this myth of the unwashed masses come from? It started largely with writers from the Renaissance. They wanted to distinguish their own time, a rebirth of classical art and learning, from the centuries that came before. And to make their own era seem brighter, they had to paint the Middle Ages as dark. They mocked medieval scholarship, art, and customs, including their habits of hygiene. Then, a few centuries later, the Victorians in the 19th century really cemented the idea. The Victorians were obsessed with sanitation. They were building massive sewer systems in London and developing new theories about public health. They looked back at the medieval period and were horrified. They read accounts from medieval moralists who complained about the debauchery in public bathhouses, and they misinterpreted this. They didn't see it as evidence that bathhouses were popular. They saw it as evidence that bathing itself was sinful and rare. The Victorians, with their own rigid moral codes and their pride in their industrial progress, created the enduring image of the filthy medieval peasant that we still carry around in our heads. But the actual evidence from the Middle Ages tells a very different story. We have archaeological finds, like combs made of bone and wood, tweezers, and even ear scoops found in digs from Viking settlements to medieval castles. These are everyday personal grooming tools. We have medieval texts, from medical treatises to books on manners, that give explicit advice on keeping clean. They advise washing your hands before and after meals. They recommend washing your face in the morning. They give recipes for making soap and even for scented waters to rinse with. Art from the period also shows people bathing. You can find illustrations and manuscripts of people sitting in wooden tubs, often with a linen sheet lining the tub to prevent splinters. Sometimes they are shown being served food and wine while they soak. This wasn't something to be hidden or ashamed of. It was a normal and often pleasurable part of life. So, the idea that an entire society of people for 1,000 years just decided not to wash is frankly ridiculous. Humans have a natural desire to be clean. It feels good. It's refreshing. Medieval people were no different. They lived in a world without modern conveniences, a world that was certainly smellier and messier than our own. But they had their own standards, their own routines, and their own culture of cleanliness. The story isn't about people who never bathed. The real story is about how they bathed, why they bathed, and what being clean meant to them in their own time. It's a much more interesting story than the myth we've been told. So if they were bathing, how were they actually doing it? For most people, hygiene was a home-based affair, centered around simple tools and a lot of effort. It wasn't as easy as turning a knob. Water was heavy, heating, it took time and fuel, like wood or charcoal, which cost money or labor to gather. A full-body hot bath was a genuine luxury, something you did as a treat, not as a daily routine. The most common form of washing was the daily wash. This was the medieval equivalent of brushing your teeth and washing your face when you get up. Almost everyone, from a farmer to a lord, would have a basin and a pitcher, usually made of pottery or sometimes metal for the wealthy. First thing in the morning, they would pour cold water into the basin and wash their hands, face, and neck. Simple way to wake up and feel refreshed. This was considered a basic requirement of civilized life. Your hand washing was especially important. It was a social and religious ritual. People were expected to wash their hands before and after every meal. In a time when Most people ate with their fingers. This was just common sense. In a noble household, a servant would come around with a pitcher of water, often scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender, and a basin for guests to wash their hands right at the table. For a peasant family, it might just be a shared bucket outside the door, but the principle was the same. Clean hands were a sign of good manners. When it came to a full body bath, things got more complicated. The iconic image is the wooden tub. These tubs were basically large barrels, often portable. They could be brought inside and placed near the hearth for warmth. This was a big production. Servants, or family members in a poorer household, would have to haul bucket after bucket of water from the well or river. Then they'd have to heat some of it over the fire, pot by pot, and mix it with the cold water in the tub to get a comfortable temperature. Because of all this work, a single tub of hot water would often be used by the entire family, one person after another, starting with the most important person in the household, usually the father or lord. To make the experience more comfortable, they would sometimes line the tub with a linen cloth. This kept you from getting splinters from the wood and felt nicer on the skin. Like the wealthy might even have a sort of tent or canopy erected over the tub to trap the steam and keep out drafts. Bathing was a time for relaxation. People would often eat, drink wine, and chat while they soaked. For a king or a great lord, the bath was a place to unwind and sometimes even to conduct business with close advisors. What did they use for soap? They had it, but it wasn't like our modern fragrant bars. Medieval soap was typically made from animal fat, like tallow or lard, mixed with a strong alkali like lye, which was derived from wood ash. This created a harsh, greasy soap that was very effective at cutting through dirt, but it probably wouldn't have smelled very good and could be rough on the skin. Wealthier people could afford soaps made with olive oil, which were imported from Spain and Italy. These were milder and considered a luxury item. People also added things to their bath water to make it smell better and soften their skin, like herbs, flowers, and oatmeal. The bathing habits of the rich and poor were, of course, different. A wealthy noble had servants to do all the heavy lifting. Their castle might have a dedicated bathing room, sometimes with a permanent tub made of stone or lead, though portable wooden ones remained common. They could afford the fuel to heat plenty of water and could bathe relatively frequently if they chose. For a peasant family living in a small cottage, a full body bath was a much rarer event. It might happen a few times a year, perhaps connected to holidays or special occasions. Their daily hygiene would have relied on the simple basin wash. They focused on what was visible and what mattered most: clean hands and a clean face. But even for the poor, getting clean was possible. In the summer, people would bathe in rivers and lakes. This was the easiest bath of all. It required no hauling or heating of water. It was a social activity, a way to cool off and get clean at the same time. Of course, this was only an option in good weather. In the cold winter months, the effort of an indoor bath was often too great for many to bother with, so they made do with a daily basin wash. Life at home, in the Middle Ages, was a constant battle against dirt. The floors were often just earth or covered in rushes, which collected dust and scraps of food. The smoke from the open fire filled the air. Animals sometimes shared the living space. In this environment, the simple act of washing your face in a basin of cold water was a small but significant way to create order and cleanliness in a messy world. It was a ritual that separated the start of the day from the night, a mark of being a person who took care of themselves. It wasn't a world of pristine bathrooms, but it was far from a world where no one cared about being clean. Or bathing wasn't just something people did at home. For a large part of the Middle Ages, one of the most popular places to go for a good soak was the public bathhouse. These establishments, often called stews, were a central part of city life. They were a direct legacy from the Roman Empire, which had built grand public baths all across its territories. The tradition didn't completely die with the fall of Rome. It survived and adapted, becoming a social institution in its own right. Imagine a medieval city. The streets are narrow, crowded, and probably muddy. Houses are crammed together. For the average person living in these conditions, a private hot bath at home was a near impossibility. The public bathhouse was the solution. It offered hot water, steam rooms, and a place to get thoroughly clean for a small fee. They were incredibly popular. Most towns of any significant size had at least one, and major cities like Paris had dozens. Walking into a medieval bathhouse would have been an assault on the senses. The air would be thick with steam, and the sound of people talking and laughing. Unlike the strict segregation of sexes we might expect, men and women often bathed together, especially in the earlier medieval period. This communal nudity was not seen as inherently shameful, at least not at first. The focus was on cleanliness and socializing. The bathhouses were much more than just a place to wash. They were community centers. You didn't just go for a quick scrub, you went to spend the afternoon. People would eat and drink while they bathed. Attendants would bring trays of food and wine right to the tubs. You could get a haircut from a barber who often doubled as a surgeon, offering services like bloodletting and tooth pulling. You could get a massage. It was a one-stop shop for grooming and health. This social aspect was key. The bathhouse was a place where the normal rules of society were relaxed. People from different social classes might mingle in a way they wouldn't on the street. It was a place for gossip, for making business deals, and for relaxing with friends. The act of bathing was shared, and this created a sense of community. The bathhouse was the medieval equivalent of a pub, a cafe, and a spa all rolled into one. Of course, this relaxed and intimate atmosphere had a downside. Over time, the bathhouses, or stews, gained a reputation for being centers of vice. With all the nudity, drinking, and relaxed morals, it's not surprising that many of them also doubled as brothels. The term stew itself eventually became synonymous with a brothel. This reputation was not entirely undeserved. Many bathhouse keepers did indeed offer the services of prostitutes alongside hot water and a good meal. This seedy side of the bathhouse culture drew the attention of the authorities and the church. Moralists began to preach against the stews, calling them dens of sin and debauchery. They were particularly scandalized by the practice of men and women bathing together. Over time, regulations were put in place to try and curb these activities. Some towns mandated separate bathing days for men and women, or even separate facilities altogether. But the reputation stuck. Then, in the mid-14th century, something happened that changed European society forever: the Black Death. The plague wiped out a huge portion of the population and created a pervasive climate of fear. People became deeply suspicious of things they had once taken for granted. The medical theories of the day were based on the idea of miasma, or bad air. Doctors and scholars began to speculate that hot water and steam opened up the pores of the skin, making it easier for this poisonous air to enter the body and cause disease. This was a devastating blow to the public bathhouse. Suddenly, a place of health and relaxation was seen as a death trap. People became terrified that gathering in a warm, steamy, crowded room was a direct invitation to get sick. The fear of contagion, combined with the already simmering moral objections from the church, was a powerful combination. The final nail in the coffin for many bathhouses came with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Protestant leaders like Martin Luther and John Calvin placed a strong emphasis on modesty, sobriety, and moral purity. They saw the bathhouses, with their history of licentiousness, as a symbol of Catholic decadence and sin. The moral condemnation grew even stronger, and public bathing fell sharply out of favor in many parts of Northern Europe. So, the great era of the public bathhouse came to a close. It wasn't that people suddenly decided they didn't want to be clean anymore. Rather, the primary place where they had gone to get clean was now seen as both morally corrupt and dangerously unhealthy. The practice of bathing became more private, pushed back into the home, and the memory of the communal, social, and often rowdy medieval bathhouse began to fade, replaced by a new set of ideas about hygiene, privacy, and morality. The disappearance of these institutions played a huge role in creating the later myth that medieval people simply didn't bathe at all. Well, people forgot that for centuries, going to the stews was as normal as going to the market. Being clean in the Middle Ages was about more than just soaking in a tub. Bathing, especially a full-body bath, could be infrequent due to the labor involved. So, people relied on a whole range of other habits and practices to maintain their personal hygiene and appearance. Cleanliness was a broad concept that included clean clothes, tidy hair, fresh breath, and pleasant smells. It was a constant effort, a way of presenting oneself to the world. One of the most important aspects of hygiene was laundry. Having clean clothes was a major status symbol. We might think of medieval clothes as brown, drab, and dirty, but people went to enormous lengths to keep them clean, especially their undergarments. Most people wore a linen or hemp shift or shirt directly against their skin. This layer was crucial. It absorbed the sweat and oils from the body, protecting the more expensive outer garments, which were often made of wool and were much harder to clean. Doing the laundry was a massive, labor-intensive chore, and it was almost exclusively women's work. It wasn't a matter of tossing things in a machine. It was an all-day or even multi-day process. First, the clothes were soaked, often in a mixture of water and lye, a harsh cleaning agent made from wood ash. For stubborn stains and to whiten linen, they sometimes used a surprising ingredient: stale urine. The ammonia in urine acted as a powerful bleach. After soaking, the clothes were pounded against rocks, trampled by foot in a large tub, or beaten with a wooden paddle called a beetle. This was the physical agitation needed to force the dirt out. Finally, they were rinsed thoroughly in a river or stream and laid out on bushes or grass to dry and be bleached by the sun. It was backbreaking work, but it was essential. A person with a clean white linen collar or cuffs peeking out from their tunic was signaling that they were respectable and took care of themselves. Grooming was another daily concern. Archaeologists frequently uncover personal grooming tools from medieval sites. Combs were one of the most common personal items. People owned combs made of wood, bone, or ivory and used them to keep their hair tidy and, crucially, to remove lice and fleas. Head lice were a persistent problem, and combing was the primary line of defense. People also took pride in their hairstyles. You can see it in medieval art, women with long, elaborate braids and men with neat, styled hair. They also cared about facial hair. Barbers were essential tradesmen in any town. They didn't just cut hair docker. They also shaved men's beards, which was done with a straight razor. For the wealthy, a clean-shaven face or a neatly trimmed beard was a sign of good breeding. Tweezers were also common, used for plucking stray hairs. What about their teeth? They didn't have toothbrushes or toothpaste, but they did try to keep their mouths clean. The most common method was to rub the teeth and gums with a piece of rough linen cloth. Sometimes they would dip the cloth in an abrasive substance to help scrub away plaque and stains. These tooth powders could be made from things like salt, chalk, or powdered charcoal. They also used chew sticks, which were small twigs from certain types of trees. The chewing on the end of the stick would fray the fibers, creating a primitive brush, and the sap from the wood often had antiseptic properties. To combat bad breath, they would chew on herbs like parsley, mint, or cloves, or use mouthwashes made from water infused with spices and herbs. The dental health was generally poor by modern standards, and tooth decay was rampant, but it wasn't for a total lack of trying. Finally, there was the matter of smell. In a world without daily showers and effective deodorants, managing body odor was a real concern. People didn't just resign themselves to smelling bad. They used a variety of strategies to smell pleasant. One of the most common was to use scented water for washing hands and face or for rinsing clothes. They would infuse water with rose petals, lavender, or other fragrant flowers. Perfumes, though expensive, were also used. These were typically oil-based and derived from flowers, spices, and resins. People would dab them on their skin and clothes. A more common item was a pomander. This was a small metal ball, often highly decorated with holes in it. Inside, you would place a mixture of aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, cloves, and other spices. People would carry these pomanders around on a chain, holding them up to their nose to ward off the unpleasant smells of the street, and also in the mistaken belief that the good smells could protect them from disease. They also scented their homes and their clothing. They would strew sweet-smelling herbs like meadowsweet and lavender on the floor among the rushes. They would place sachets of dried herbs in their chests with their clothes to keep them fresh. All of these practices show that medieval people were highly attuned to the world of scent. They sought out pleasant smells and did their best to combat unpleasant ones, both on their bodies and in their environment. It was all part of a holistic approach to cleanliness that went far beyond simply getting in a tub of water. It was about creating a clean, orderly, and pleasant personal space in a world that was often anything but. If medieval people really did all this washing and grooming, then why is the myth of the filthy peasant so incredibly persistent? Why do we still instinctively picture the Middle Ages as a time of grime and stench? The answer is complex. The myth wasn't created by a single lie, but was built up over centuries by different groups of people for their own reasons. It's a story about how we view the past and how every era reinterprets history to suit its own values. The first blows against the reputation of the Middle Ages were struck during the Renaissance. Thinkers and artists of the 14th and 15th centuries saw themselves as part of a great rebirth of the classical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. To define their own era as one of light and progress, they needed to cast the preceding 1,000 years as an age of darkness and stagnation. They called it the Middle Age, a supposedly empty period between the glories of antiquity and their own brilliant revival. This was a powerful piece of marketing. Writers like Petrarch openly scorned the darkness of the recent past. This general attitude of contempt for all things medieval created a fertile ground for myths to grow. If medieval philosophy and art were considered crude, it was easy to assume their personal habits were crude as well. Then came the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Philosophers and scientists prioritized reason, skepticism, and scientific inquiry. They looked back on the Middle Ages as a time dominated by superstition and religious dogma. They saw the medieval church's power as a force that had held back human progress. In their narrative, the medieval period was backward in every way. The idea that people living in such an enlightened time would also be unhygienic fit perfectly with their worldview. But the group that did the most to cement the myth in our popular imagination was the Victorians. In the 19th century, Britain and other industrializing nations were undergoing a sanitation revolution. For the first time in history, cities were building massive coordinated sewer systems. And doctors were beginning to understand germ theory. Personal and public hygiene became a central Victorian obsession, a hallmark of a civilized and modern society. Cleanliness, as they said, was next to godliness. Armed with this new sanitary zeal, the Victorians looked back at the past and were appalled by what they saw, or what they thought they saw. They read medieval texts where religious writers warned against vanity and excessive bathing. They read the moralists who condemned the public bathhouses as places of sin. The Victorians, with their strict and often prudish moral codes, took these warnings out of context. They didn't interpret them as a debate within medieval society about the right way to bathe. Instead, they took them as proof that all bathing was considered sinful and that, therefore, nobody did it. They projected their own values onto the past. Since they could not imagine communal bathing without it being scandalous, they assumed medieval people must have abandoned it entirely for moral reasons. They saw the lack of modern plumbing not as a technological difference, but as a moral failing. Their own progress in sanitation made them feel superior, and they used the dirty Middle Ages as a convenient backdrop to highlight their own achievements. It was the Victorians who really fleshed out the caricature, the flea-infested peasant, the queen who bathed only twice a year, the streets flowing with raw sewage. Some of these details had a grain of truth. Medieval streets were certainly not clean, but they were exaggerated and woven into a narrative of near-total squalor. This image was so powerful and so simple that it stuck. It made its way into history books, novels, and eventually into movies and television. It's an easy visual shorthand. If you want to show that a setting is old and primitive, you make everyone dirty. It saves time and effort. You don't have to explain the complex realities of medieval society. You just show a man with mud on his face, and the audience gets it. So the myth endures. It's a combination of Renaissance, intellectual snobbery, Enlightenment prejudice, and Victorian sanitary superiority. It's also a misunderstanding of the evidence. Medieval people were not modern people. They didn't have our knowledge or our technology. Their world was tougher, messier, and smellier than ours. But they were not idiots, and they were not content to live in filth. They had a complex and practical culture of cleanliness. They washed their hands, combed their hair, laundered their clothes, and enjoyed a hot bath when they could get one. The truth is, as it so often is, much more nuanced and far more interesting than the myth. They were simply people, doing the best they could with what they had, in the world that they knew.